Hey everyone, welcome to this explainer. Today we're diving into a really provocative historical analysis. We're going to completely unpack the hidden and frankly often ruthless mechanics of institutional power. It really boils down to this one profound question. How exactly do grand grassroots ideologies end up transforming into massive ruling empires? Let's get right into it. Take a look at this. This is the core historical paradox our source text presents. On one hand, you've got the origins of a movement that's described as radically pacifist and completely voluntary. It was essentially a grassroots gathering totally rooted in love and surrender. But fast forward to the outcome, and what do we see? A massive earthly empire deeply focused on wealth gathering and demanding absolute obedience. The author of our text makes a really fascinating argument here. They argue this transformation wasn't just some historical accident, it wasn't a gentle search for truth. To go from those pacifist origins to that imperial outcome, the institution literally had to re-engineer itself from the ground up. And think about it, how do you force millions of people to just go along with a massive shift like that? Well, it takes some seriously heavy-duty tools. So here's our roadmap for the analysis. We'll start with the great historical paradox. Then we'll break down the text's central argument that this empire was built on two distinct pillars. Pillar 1, fraud, and Pillar 2, coercion. Finally, we'll wrap up by looking at what the author calls the chilling price of power.
All right, Section 1, the great historical paradox.
The whole foundation of the author's argument is summed up in this incredibly blunt thesis right from the text. It says, to build an earthly empire, one must use earthly tools. And by earthly tools, they mean police, which is coercion, and propaganda, which is fraud. The author is basically saying that once a pacifist movement decides, hey, we're building an empire now, it has to adopt the exact same playbook as every other ruling empire in history. Massive ideological shifts that want to control millions, yeah, they simply do not run on pure goodwill. They absolutely require systematic enforcement.
Which brings us right into Section 2, the first pillar of power, fraud.
The source text actually traces the evolution of this institutional propaganda across three completely distinct historical eras. To justify hoarding all this wealth and power, the text argues that the institution relied heavily on deliberate falsification and financial manipulation. We're going to walk through this timeline together. We'll start in the 8th century, move through the Middle Ages, and come right up to the modern day, just to see exactly how this pillar of fraud was built and kept standing for so long.
Guys, the sheer scale of this deception is honestly staggering. Our first stop on the timeline is the donation of Constantine. The author actually calls this the most audacious, brazen fraud in all of European history. Back in the 8th century, a document was forged, basically claiming that the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great had officially handed over rule of the entire Western Roman Empire directly to the Pope. And for hundreds of years, the papacy used this completely fake document to justify its claim to secular, worldly power. They essentially used it to legally merge the cross and the sword. It wasn't until the 15th century that a scholar named Lorenzo Valla conclusively proved it was a total fake. But by then, the power structure was already permanently cemented in place. Now, moving into the Middle Ages, we hit a concept the text defines as transactional faith. Think of this as a theological business model, where God is basically treated like a giant accountant in the sky. The institution invented this theological construct known as purgatory and coupled it with this idea of a treasury of extra merits that had been earned by saints. And the mechanics of this operation? Absolutely wild. As the author points out, the institution realized they could literally sell these imaginary, invisible merits in exchange for real, heavy, physical gold. We know this as the sale of indulgences. This created a massive, almost unimaginable revenue stream, which was then poured into funding devastating wars and building colossal monuments, like St. Peter's Basilica. And if you think that's all ancient history, the text argues this pillar of fraud is still very much alive and well today, mostly in the form of the prosperity gospel. You've probably seen this. Modern televangelists promise miraculous healing or just insane amounts of wealth. But of course, there's a catch. It always requires the viewer to plant a financial seed, and by seed they mean making a cash donation to their organization. The author doesn't sugarcoat this at all, calling it a classic scam. It's described as a highly sophisticated psychological and financial manipulation that specifically zeroes in on the most vulnerable people in society, mostly the sick and the poor.
Okay, moving on to Section 3, the second pillar of power, coercion.
Because here's the thing, propaganda and fraud, they can only get an empire so far. When that first pillar failed to keep people in line, the source text claims the second pillar took over with a vengeance, coercion. The author outlines that once this movement morphed into a state-backed religion, freedom of belief was systematically crushed, and they didn't just swing swords around, They used a really sophisticated multi-layered approach to force compliance. It happened in 3 distinct steps: physical coercion, psychological coercion, and intellectual coercion. Let's break down exactly how each of these functions.
Step 1 was physical coercion. The text makes a really great point here. The doctrine of absolute exclusivity, this idea that there is zero salvation outside of the institution, that could never have survived without the protection of state violence. So what did they do? They criminalized doubt itself. The Inquisition is the classic example here. Heresy wasn't just a simple difference of opinion anymore. It was legally classified as treason against the state. If you disagreed with a bishop, you definitely weren't getting invited to a friendly theological debate. No, you were facing torture or excommunication, which the author points out was basically social death back then, and, very frequently, being burned at the stake.
But as you can imagine, constant physical violence is expensive. It's messy. And that leads us to step 2, psychological coercion. The text calls this the theology of fear. The institution essentially framed God as a terrifying tyrant. Everyday populations were fed this constant diet of terror, threats of eternal fire, the agonizing tortures of purgatory, and this pervasive idea that demons were literally lurking behind every single corner. And why do this? Well, the author argues that populations living in a constant state of absolute terror regarding their immortal souls are incredibly easy to control. A terrified populace will willingly, even eagerly, hand over their freedom and their property to the very institution that claims to hold the keys to hell.
And that brings us to the final step in this system, intellectual coercion, which goes right after the conscience. It's fascinating how the text applies this to different historical factions. On one side, you have the historical Catholic approach of straight-up banning the reading of the Bible in everyday national languages, literally up until the 20th century. On the flip side, you have the Protestant fundamentalist approach, which forced a strict, literal belief in the text, totally disregarding modern science. Even though the methods were completely different, the author argues the end goal was exactly the same, to completely break an individual's capacity for critical thinking. It ensures they stay forever dependent on whatever the ruling authority tells them to believe.
Which brings us to our final section. Section 4, the chilling price of power.
We've seen all the mechanics now, but what is the ultimate conclusion of our source material? Well, this staggering ideological contradiction is captured perfectly by this quote right here. A carpenter from Nazareth, who preached surrender and love for enemies, became a symbol under which people were burned and immense wealth was gathered. I mean, wow. When you put the starting line and the finish line of this historical trajectory side by side, it is truly jarring. The distance between the original message of this movement and the ultimate institutional reality is just astronomically vast.
And that leads straight into the author's stark, final analytical conclusion. They argue that an institutional paradox of this sheer magnitude simply cannot hold itself together organically. It's impossible. Without the extreme, heavy-handed methods of power we just mapped out, without the massive, systemic fraud of forged documents and transactional faith, and without the brutal, multi-layered coercion of physical and psychological terror, an institutional contradiction like this would have simply collapsed under its own weight. It needed those pillars to stand. So, as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a really big question to chew on. Based on the mechanics of power we explored in this text today, how do institutions balance their original, pure ideals with the pragmatic and honestly often ruthless pursuit of enduring power? Is it just inevitable? To survive and scale up, does a movement eventually have to trade its soul for the sword? Take this framework of propaganda and coercion we looked at today and try applying it to other empires, corporations, or institutions throughout history. See what parallels you find. Anyway, thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep analyzing, and I'll catch you in the next one.